Okay. Samoj asked a follow-up question. Why is Ukraine and NATO incrementally more threatening given the Baltics are already in? Regarding missiles and flight time, wouldn't whatever equilibrium currently holds in the Baltics apply in Ukraine too? Regarding land invasion frontier, don't the Baltics already make it unfixably giant? Okay, those are all excellent questions, and I want to address them. So let's go through them one by one. The first one, why is Ukraine and NATO incrementally more threatening given the Baltics are already in? Okay, I would argue that the Ukraine in NATO is much more than incrementally threatening. So let's zoom in on the map here and see. Probably, can you see my cursor? Well, anyway. Alright. Can we go 3D on this one? No. Alright. Why is Ukraine and NATO incrementally more threatening given the Baltics are already in? Okay. I'll try to give the answers broadly from most simple to most complex. Okay, Ukraine is way bigger than the Baltics, so that's an issue. In terms of distance, the distance from the border of Ukraine to the border of Moscow is slightly larger, not by much, and so that's a pretty weak argument. Large-scale land wars tend to be fought with a strategy of defence in depth, because what the aggressor usually tries to do, historically speaking, and we saw this happen when the Wehrmacht was on the Eastern Front, is to try and punch through a hole in the enemy's defence line and then drive a column of tanks through that and then perform a classic Napoleonic envelopment so that you can create what they call a cauldron, right? An area that's cut off so it can't be resupplied, and then you just slowly squeeze that until the people inside give up, or you destroy them all. So having a large flat area like Ukraine, which is amenable to those sorts of strategies. By the way, this is exactly what Russia is doing in eastern Ukraine right now, although with the handbrake on. Whereas trying to do that same thing in the Balkans, because the Balkans are so much smaller, the amount of defence in depth that you can establish is less. So for Moscow to drive through Ukraine, and Ukraine is split because of this big river, the first thing they need to do is take all of eastern Ukraine. Then they can start working on western Ukraine. Now they've been setting up the thing in Kiev as well, which is also really important, right? So in a hypothetical land war in which France, Germany and Poland tried to push onto Russia, and in a no-nuke scenario, and this is one of the problems of international relations, is that all of this war planning is basically redundant, because if it got bad, people would start tossing nukes around, and a nuclear exchange would make the entire thing redundant. Okay, what was I saying? Yeah, so in a land war, the Blue Force would have to push into the Ukraine, and the Red Force would have to try and stop them, and it would give Ukraine would have a really large defence in depth where you can just step back and impose disproportionate losses over and over and over again, and essentially wear down the attacking forces. Or if Red Force was attacking and NATO held Ukraine, they could do the exact same thing in the opposite way. Sorry, my chair's quite squeaky, Whereas to try and perform that same thing in the Balkans, if Moscow's land army was in Belarus, let's say in Minsk here, the push to the coast would essentially just cut off the entire thing. So the ability to kettle those areas to use this cauldron tactic would be really simple. So in that sense, I think that's probably like one of the strongest arguments I have about why Ukraine is more important than the Baltics. Okay, now the other issue is, remember that Russia has the Kaliningrad square here, and this gap, which I think is the Suwalski Gap is the name for it, because Russia has Belarus and Kaliningrad, this tiny little gap would be absolutely trivial for the Russian army to block, to cut this, right? And then once they do that, they have a massive defensive arena. Now, you can still resupply across the Baltic Sea, no problem, but to try and drive a land force across this strong barrier is much easier than trying to drive is much more difficult than trying to drive a land force across into western Ukraine. You will have noticed that in the recent ongoing conflict, what the Russians didn't do is drive all of their forces up to the edge of Belarus and then just cut south to cut off all of this. And if they cut to this Carpathian Mountains, that would essentially, cut off the resupply routes from NATO into Ukraine. Now, you could make the argument that would be a good strategy, and I'm sure that they considered doing that. But the problem is that Ukraine is so huge that that's not really an effective cauldron, right? Because the Ukrainian forces can still move around between all of the major cities on the roads. I was going to say no problem. There are problems, but they would be able to do that. Whereas, if you cut off this Suwalski Gap here, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, with the greatest respect to those peoples, I think that they would probably fall pretty quickly if they came under hard Russian pressure. Now, I haven't addressed the nuclear issue, right? Why, if my argument is that Russia simply cannot allow Ukraine to enter NATO because it would allow the close stationing of nuclear weapons and essentially turn Moscow into a suzerain of US power, then can I not make the same argument about Estonia? Should we not make exactly the same argument about Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, as Simoj has pointed out? And the answer to that question is yes, well spotted, that's exactly correct. However, let me ask the same question, but sort of back to front or inside out. Why hasn't NATO stationed nuclear weapons in Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania? I put it to you that the answer to that question is because NATO knows that Moscow's back is already up against the wall and it can't take a step back. So to do that would be to force Moscow to act. Now, the old rule is you don't get to have a new war until you've finished your old one, right? So it's not that Russia doesn't care about the Baltic states. They absolutely do. It's just that you don't want to be running two wars simultaneously. You want to prioritise your actions. And in strategy, you must always have your actions prioritised, right? Because everything needs to be focused about whatever your central goal is. So if the central goal of Russia is to become militarily secure, which means forcing NATO back to a position where Russia feels like it can do defence in depth, has enough time to recognise the flight time of nuclear weapons and respond in kind, and also to anchor in the Carpathian Mountains in order to reduce all of the gaps on their borders, which they have been historically invaded by, down to the smallest possible, so that they can become the most secure, then their prioritisation schema will be first take Ukraine, second take the Baltic states, and then third, decide what to do next. Because it's entirely possible that Russia will decide that if they can take the western Ukraine, which looks a bit sketchy at the moment, in Lviv, and this border, right, up to here, and they can take the Balts. If they take the Balts in the Ukraine, they might decide there's no need to take Poland, as much as they would like to be able to anchor in the smallest, shortest gap here. the gap between the Carpathians and Kaliningrad in a curve here might be enough to satisfy them. That would be my expectation, that it would be like that. Okay, that's the first question. Regarding missiles and flight time, wouldn't whatever equilibrium currently holds in the Baltics apply to Ukraine too? Yes, that's correct. And I think I've answered that question already. Okay, regarding the land invasion frontier, don't the Baltics already make it unfixably giant? Yes, they make the length of the land border unfixably giant. That is a massive problem. However, because the Balts are sort of already under the hammer of Russian power, unlike Ukraine, then it's less of an issue. And I mean, Moscow has a naval port in St. Petersburg, surely, right? So there would be a very short and bloody knife fight in the naval Baltic area, presumably, if Russia moved into the Balts. I don't think that they will move into the Balts while they are NATO powers, but it's an extremely interesting question about whether or not they would actually do that, because the question of US commitment to defend the Baltic nations, I mean, Article 5 of the treaty would be invoked, but like I say, treaties are worth the paper that they're written on. Actually, as soon as the war starts is the time whether or not all of the powers that are assigned to the treaty decide whether they want to get involved or not. It's possible that the United States will just say, well, that's a shame, but we're not going to fight for Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. And then it's a question of, what do the other countries do? Will Poland and Germany and France fight for Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania? Maybe they will just take exactly the same response that they've taken in Ukraine. Economic sanctions, and we supply them with some weapons to try and bleed the advance, but basically just give up. Go, well, they're going to take it, I suppose. If they did, keep in mind that, bizarrely, that would probably be a stabilising influence on the balance of power in Europe. Yeah, it's balanced on a knife edge. My hunch is that Russia won't attempt to take the Balts unless there's like a rapid change in situation. But, you know, I said in the last video, it's like poker, right? In the poker game of the Baltic nations, who's willing to make a big bet? And the only bets are really, really big. Anyway, I'm starting to ramble now, so I hope that answered your question.